In this oral, I will be discussing two different texts written throughout history. One that was originally written in English, and one that is a work in translation that was originally written in another language and was translated into English later. The book originally written in English that I'll be discussing today is Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell, while the work in translation that I'll be studying is called The Elephant Vanishes by Japanese author Haruki Murakami. To begin, Down and Out in Paris and London was written by George Orwell, which is the pen name for Eric Arthur Blair, who was an English novelist, critic, and journalist born in 1902. He is famous for his cultural critiques in many of his works, famously critiquing authoritarianism, capitalism, and communism, while being an avid advocate for democratic socialism seen in many of his texts. Orwell is most famous for his book Animal Farm, which discusses a group of animals on a farm who overthrow the farmer to create a more fair and just society where all animals are happy, which soon collapses into chaos that none of the animals are able to fix. This was praised for being a great representation and metaphor for the various parties and people in the Soviet Union, with many of the animals representing different powerful people who controlled the communist Soviet Union at the time. Another one of his most famous works is one we'll be studying today called Down and Out in Paris and London, which is a work that details Orwell's fictional autobiography about his experiences in the French city of Paris, as well as the British city of London, where he goes in between jobs working for both hotels and restaurants, and focuses on the themes of culture and poverty throughout the entirety of the text. The Elephant Vanishes, our work in translation that we'll be studying today, was written by Japanese author Haruki Murakami, who was born in 1949. And since he was a boy, he has been very interested in American literature and has been inspired to blend both American and his home Japanese culture into many of his works, creating what he feels to be a great balance between various cultures to create his style of writing. To begin, Down and Out in Paris and London, as you know, follows Orwell's adventures throughout two different Western European cities as he works for different restaurants and hotels throughout the two cities. I feel like this book demonstrates the global issue of justice very strongly, as especially in chapter 3 of Paris and London, Orwell describes his poverty and the struggles one faces, as well as the general suffering of the poor in many of these urban cities in Western Europe. He describes his need to steal food simply because he cannot afford any himself and he must steal without dying, as well as the embarrassment of poverty when others ask him why he cannot buy alcohol or laundry anymore, the lack of basic necessities like haircuts or laundry or alcohol, as well as basic hygiene like being able to shave or clean yourself. I feel like this describes the global issue of justice very well, as this demonstrates the lack of justice for many of the poor in these sprawling urban areas in the mid 20th century, as many were starving to death just blocks down the street from people who make millions every year. Because in a few later chapters of Paris and London, once Orwell finally receives a job at the hotel he calls Hotel X, he describes a life of optimacy and riches where he is able to finally buy bread, meat, and wine for himself and his friend every night after he gets paid barely enough for a living wage. And this also describes the global issue of justice very, very well, because it shows how impoverished and mistreated he has been throughout his life, to where he thinks a few dollars a day is a life of pure opulence, and and he feels that it's a great privilege to be able to simply afford enough liquor and meat to be able to survive for the rest of the day. And it describes just the injustice that many impoverished people face throughout the cities, both in his time and today as well. His poverty is not something that can be particularly helped, but is an injustice. It is an injustice for him to need to fight every day just to not starve to death, to be able to to work another day for the rich people that barely give him any money each day to barely survive, and demonstrates the lack of justice for those who cannot make enough money in cities all around the world. Similarly, in the book The Elephant Vanishes, there is a short story Haruki Murakami wrote called The Little Green Monster, which describes the suffering of this small monster at the hands of a woman when he proposes his love for her. The story starts with the woman sitting at a chair after her husband leaves for work and looking out the window at her garden. When she looks out, she sees a small monster crawling up out of the soil of her garden and walking to her door. When she enters, he professes his love for her and asks for her hand in marriage, but she promptly refuses, thinking of how ugly he is and how just disgusting she finds him. He seemingly hears her thinking that because he shrivels up with each insult that she throws at him in her mind. And she very rapidly begins to barrage him with more and more insults in her mind until he eventually shrivels up to a husk and just disappears altogether. While someone being killed for being objectively unattractive may seem very crude and almost horrendous in American culture, when you think about it through the culture of which it has been translated in Japan, it may not seem as unusual. In Haruki's home culture of Japan, people are typically expected to follow the general conformity of society in Japan, having the same likes, looks, speech patterns, stuff like that. And when people do not follow that societal norm, whereas they like different things, they speak differently, and in this case, they look differently, they're typically shunned by most people until they either voluntarily or are forced to leave the societal mold and just kind of fend for themselves throughout their life. I feel like this story is a metaphor where the monster is represented by the people who have traits that are undesirable in Japan, whether it be a physical disability, a speech impediment, or any other type of personality disorder, while the woman is a representation of the general members of Japanese society who shun out and destroy this monster simply because they do not find them attractive. I feel like this is a great example of the global issue of justice because it demonstrates once more simply like how the poor are treated in Orwell's story in Paris and London, how people with physical ailments or just simply personality, things that people don't want in their society, are typically shunned by the people in Japan who do conform to the societal norms because they do not find it desirable. And these people just find such a lack of justice in their world simply for something they cannot help, that they cannot help but just to feel completely isolated from everyone around them. Despite both these texts coming from vastly different backgrounds, both are able to convey the same global issue of lack of justice for the pitfalls of unchanging traits in humans, whether it be poverty and just being able to have a lack of basic necessities for life in Paris and London by Orwell, or having physical ailments that are found undesirable by the people in the culture of Japan in The Little Green Monster by Haruki Murakami. Both these show a lack of the global issue of justice in their lives because people are shown to have inherent prejudices against people that they do not find desirable, whether it be the rich against the poor or the normal people against who they would find undesirable for their own society. Both of these books, from vastly different cultures around the world, demonstrate how humans are inherently selfish and they will take any opportunity to climb the economic or social ladder at the cost of one another. This is easily seen in Orwell's book, Paris and London, when he describes the upper class people who dine in his hotel, who make thousands, and in this case millions of dollars every year, while his people, like the people who work in the kitchen, are paid barely a few dollars a day, enough to be able to buy alcohol and meat for the day, which he finds to be a pleasure for his life, despite it being what he barely has to survive. And it demonstrates how the rich people, even today, and as well as in the time period that it was written, use poor people as a kind of tool, and the rich only like the poor as much as they can be used. They use the poor as a source of cheap labor to be able to line their pockets with more gold every day, and then cast them out once they are not useful anymore, whether they be too old or sick or disabled to be able to work anymore. This is also reflected in The Little Green Monster by Haruki Murakami, to where the people of Japan will typically cast out anyone they find undesirable so as they can make their own society more homogeneous to the traits they find desirable, whether it be the same looks, speech patterns, personality, etc. Both of these books are great examples of how people are inherently selfish, and it demonstrates the lack of the global issue of justice very strongly, as it shows how so many people just suffer from lack of justice every day for various traits that they aren't able to help or change. In conclusion, both the book Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell and the collection of short stories, including The Little Green Monster, The Elephant Vanishes by Haruki Murakami, demonstrate the global issue of justice very strongly, as both of them show how various people around the world find a lack of justice in their lives every day for simple traits that they cannot help, whether it be poverty or other things that people in their society do not find to be desirable to their own society. Thank you.